Heartfelt introduction. I appreciate your support. Yes, I have some personal experience as far as radiation exposure and measuring radiation in the body, which we'll talk about a little bit down the road in this presentation. But at the beginning, I'm sure you're asking, how in the world does radiation exposure have anything to do with nutrition, and how does nutrition have anything to do with radiation exposure? And I promise you, by the end of this presentation, you will understand the intimate relationship between them. This particular presentation I prepared to provide to the IAACN, and those are for the CCNs. A lot of them are, well, some of them are Ds, a lot of them are MDs, and some chiropractors and some DOs. And I think this might be some new information for them as well. I hope so, and I hope it enlightens everybody. So we're going to talk today about how electromagnetic energy disrupts our metabolism and cellular integrity. And I know that might be a given for some that say, well, you know, radiation isn't good for us, but we don't get exposed to that much of it, do we? So today we're going to talk about especially the sources of radiation and maybe how we can protect ourselves from those sources. So we are all exposed to radiation. That's a given. We're going to talk about background radiation, what's naturally present in the earth, what is man-made, how do we ingest it, how do we come in contact with it, and what can we do about it. The question could be, first, what type of radiation is dangerous and how much will actually cause disease? And we know for sure, and this is a given, that at threshold doses, cellular damage and dysfunction occur. You know, we drop the radioactive bombs, the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki, and we saw immediately the effects of radiation poisoning. But what happens with low-level radiation over time? And we're going to talk about that. So we know that at a certain dose, radiation is going to cause damage and possibly even death. So the industry experts, what they state is usually exposure is no worse than background radiation. So if there was a nuclear meltdown or they did some bomb testing, it's really not much worse than being out in the sun or being exposed to cosmic radiation. But health experts that have actually done this intimately conclude that there might be no safe dose of ionizing radiation, and that's one of the forms of radiation we're going to talk about today. And those are the words of John Goffman. He actually says there is no safe dose of ionizing radiation. And John Goffman was an MD, PhD. He discovered, as one of the discoverers of what we can do with nuclear energy, and he was studying uranium and plutonium and how to generate energy, and then he was told to study the health effects of that. And when he studied the health effects of that, he realized that there is really no safe dose of ionizing radiation because of the damage to the DNA that it can do. So we're going to talk about the pathogenesis of disease from exposure to ionizing radiation, and a little bit more about John Goffman. In some of these slides, you're going to see in purple and in underlined, those are links. And down the road, if you want to go back to the PowerPoint presentation, you can follow those links and you're going to find a lot more information and what I feel is evidence to support my case today that radiation is all around us and is affecting disease and our health. Okay, this presentation, again, we talk about the types of radiation and why they are important to you. You might not have thought you'd want to know about the electromagnetic spectrum, but I'll show you how important it is to our health, and common sources of radiation and the negative health effects. We're going to talk about the uptake of radioactive elements, and this is really where nutrition comes into play, because these radioactive elements, they mimic nutrients. It's as if it was a radioactive form of a nutrient, and the body really can't tell the difference. And we'll talk about what happens when we do ingest them and we absorb them, and then they get incorporated into our cells and tissues, and they cause damage right down at the cellular level and the genetic level, because they cause damage to the DNA. So the issue of exposure and measurement within the body, and that's very important. You can't just measure the environment around us. We have to look at what's actually being ingested and incorporated in the body. And we're going to talk about bioaccumulation and how we can prevent some bioaccumulation from happening. So again, we're going to define electromagnetic radiation. We're going to review common sources: air, food, water, and electronic devices. And that is the electronic devices, the far left side of the electromagnetic spectrum is non-ionizing radiation, but we're going to talk about how that affects our health as well. We're going to recognize, an objective of this presentation is that you recognize the pathogenesis of how radiation actually disrupts cells, the profound effect of radionuclides, and you'll see me use radionuclides and radioactive elements and radioisotopes interchangeably in this presentation. So basically when I say radionuclides, it's radioactive elements. Okay, let me go back, sorry about that. We're going to learn to implement actions and protocols that help us protect us from radiation exposure and the mechanisms of action. So, our first objective, to recognize the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Not that you have to memorize it, but just realize what it is. And what is electromagnetic energy? Well, it comes from charged particles, like electrons and protons. Charged particles create electromagnetic fields, and they transport energy that's called electromagnetic radiation. So charged particles, when they move, give off electromagnetic radiation. And we're going to look at the spectrum, how some is non-ionizing and not quite as dangerous to our cells, and how some of this electromagnetic radiation is ionizing radiation, which is extremely damaging to our cells. Okay, so here's our electromagnetic spectrum. And what you can take away from this slide is that this left side of the slide is a source of non-ionizing radiation. And these are kind of long, these are long wavelengths. They're a lower energy. It's a lower frequency energy at the non-ionizing end, at the left end. And as we move along the spectrum, you'll see that these wavelengths become shorter, and they increase in energy, they increase in frequency. They become very short. If you go all the way to the right side of the spectrum, you'll see that some of these wavelengths are smaller than a water molecule. And those electromagnetic waves at the right-hand side of the electromagnetic spectrum, very, very high energy. And that's where we have radioactive elements and gamma rays and X-rays. And those are the ones that are acutely damaging to cells. And if it was hard to read on that slide, I just wanted to define this a little bit. The left-hand side, the lower end, the slower waves, the lower frequency waves would be radio waves. And then as they get shorter and increase in energy, we have microwaves, infrared, and visible light. And those are all non-ionizing radiation sources. Then we move into the ultraviolet light range, and then we start to have ionizing radiation, and soft X-rays and hard X-rays, and then gamma rays and radioactive elements. And that's when you have very, very high energy, and those electromagnetic waves can be very damaging to the cell. So here's just another visual of the spectrum, and on the left we have radios, radio waves, microwaves, infrared. You can see the visible light spectrum better here. Roy G. Biv, right, we've all been taught that, the colors of the rainbow. Well, they emit a certain amount of energy, and it is electromagnetic energy. And as we move along that visible light spectrum into the ultraviolet light spectrum, we might not see it anymore, but it's very high energy, and it gives off energy. And then we move into X-rays and gamma rays, very high frequency gamma rays. So here we have the line that you can see visibly where non-ionizing radiation ends and ionizing radiation begins. And I just want you to notice that here you can see the ionizing radiation actually begins to break bonds, and it breaks carbon-to-carbon bonds. It starts to strip electrons from molecules, and it damages our DNA. So here are some of the sources, just an overview. We'll talk about these more in detail in a moment. But again, non-ionizing radiation is low frequency, low energy, long wavelength. Ionizing radiation is very high frequency, high energy, and very short wavelength. It's a known carcinogen. Ionizing radiation is a known carcinogen. So here we have our non-ionizing radiation, and that comes from things like, and we'll talk about this, but cell phones, televisions, electric motors, and things like that were around all the time. So non-ionizing radiation contains enough energy to move atoms in a molecule, and it'll vibrate them, and that's how we heat up food with microwaves. So it'll vibrate the molecule, but it's not high enough energy to strip electrons from a molecule. And you know, when we strip electrons from a molecule, it creates free radicals, right? Free radical damage. The non-ionizing radiation does cause energy disruption, and it does contribute to cell and organ dysfunction, especially if somebody is overloaded with toxins and the detoxification abilities are overwhelmed. then the non-ionizing radiation is even more damaging to the cell and the organ and the tissue and the organism. It's emitted from, again, low-frequency electromagnetic fields, radio frequencies, microwaves, and infrared and visible light. The ionizing radiation, again, and I'm using repetition as a tool here so that you know that ionizing radiation is extremely high energy. And it can strip tightly bound electrons from atoms and create ions. It can do that to water. It can do that to the water molecule. So when it strips away an electron, it creates a hydroxyl radical. And we'll talk about how dangerous that is down the road. So ionizing radiation, very high frequency, causes free radical damage. And, we always talk about antioxidants help, prevent free radical damage. But antioxidants only protect us from oxidizing free radicals, not from nitrogen free radicals or carbon free radicals. Antioxidants can't really protect us much from those free radicals. So ionizing radiation can generate electricity and it kills cancer cells. So it's really pretty versatile, and we've used it somewhat to our advantage, but it also has its disadvantages when we get exposed to it. High frequency UV radiation can break chemical bonds, and every cell contains chemical bonds, right? As food contains chemical bonds too, and we're going to talk about that a little bit with food irradiation, what happens to the bonds in food when we irradiate food. X-rays and gamma rays, they have very high frequencies and can break up the nucleus of atoms, right? And how dangerous is that? And these, especially the high frequency waves, can penetrate things. And the penetrative properties is what damages cells and tissues and organs. And again, it is a known carcinogen. And this is a slide that isn't in your presentation from last night. I apologize. I talked to Amy about the curse of PowerPoint. It's never really done. So I added this one last night. I was actually looking at it before and I hadn't found it, but I did find it last night and wanted to put it in. And this is just showing you that these are all ionizing radiation sources, but some are more penetrative than others. Like alpha particles, they bounce right off of paper. They don't go through. Beta particles do get into the skin. Medical X-rays can go right through skin and through wood, but they are stopped by cement. And gamma radiation can get into cement, but it can be stopped at a certain thickness. And then we have neutron radiation that can zoom right through cement. And that is, neutron radiation is the most damaging. And they actually use, so you look at the bottom there, the neutron radiation can make things radioactive. And it produces many of the radioactive sources that we use in medicine and academics to study radiation in industrial applications, including oil exploration. So they're using the most damaging, dangerous source of radiation when they explore for oil. Okay, so ionizing radiation, what is really happening here, the charged portion of the molecule is given enough energy to break away from the atom. And this is more, electronics than you'd ever want to know about. But the point of this is that ionizing radiation deposits a large amount of energy into a very small area. And by doing that, it can break the chemical bond between two carbon atoms. Now, I can't see you guys, but raise your hand if you have any carbon bonds in your body, right? So ionizing radiation can break those chemical bonds, those carbon-carbon bonds. And all sources of radiation, or ionizing radiation, is capable of stripping electrons from most molecules. And the three forms, the alpha, beta, and gamma, isn't that important to us. Just know that it's ionizing radiation. And now we're going to talk about more in depth about the sources. And this is just an overview. I'll go over each of these sources with their own slide. So first we have non-ionizing radiation. And sources of non-ionizing are microwaves, and that would include microwave ovens, cell phones, wireless technologies, and radar. And those are things that we're exposed to, a lot of people exposed to every day, wireless technologies. And we'll talk about some of the way that you can distance yourself from that non-ionizing radiation. You can turn off your wireless at night. Most people don't think about that, but that's an important thing to do. Electric power lines, other sources of non-ionizing radiation, proximity to them has been linked to disease, especially in children, leukemia in children. Some of that information, anyway, there was some confusion about that years ago, but now there is more evidence that proximity to the electrical power lines right near houses might be contributing to leukemia in children. Dirty electricity, electrical wires act as antennae, and they draw other non-ionizing radiation from around us, and it can cause microsurges. And that's why some buildings, they say there's dirty electricity, and the people are actually getting sick from being overexposed to dirty electricity, or just these microsurges of electricity that generate non-ionizing radiation. So electric motors, even small electromotors, and we'll talk about that in a second. Computers and televisions, fluorescent lights. And I'm no fan of fluorescent lights, those compact fluorescent lights that contain mercury. They think they're better for the environment, but if you drop them, that's actually cause for a hazardous waste cleanup because they contain mercury. So I have a couple of boxes of in the original, light bulbs. I don't like those compact fluorescent lights, but they do emit non-ionizing radiation as well as containing mercury. Home appliances, medical devices, all those emit non-ionizing radiation. And I know some of you are thinking, well, I'm exposed to some of these on a daily basis, so we'll talk about how you can reduce your exposure. And again, this is just another organization of the information. Non-ionizing radiation is emitted from low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Again, things that are around us all the time, electric power lines, medical devices, even ultrasound and thermography, and even saunas emit non-ionizing radiation. So we don't want to be overexposed to those either. Fluorescent lighting, home appliances, electrical outlets, electromotors, anybody around those every day? Power tools, even hair dryers and toothbrushes, the small electrical motors, they emit non-ionizing radiation. The radio frequencies, those are in the air all the time. There's really no way to block those. AM, FM radio, television, even MRI is a source of non-ionizing radiation. And for microwaves, we're exposed to cell phones, wireless technologies, microwave ovens, and radar. And you're really supposed to, for microwave ovens, you're supposed to maintain a distance of at least 20 inches away from a microwave oven. And some of them, as they get older, they leak. So you want to replace those immediately. And this is another, I'm waiting for permission, actually, for this slide. So I might go to jail for putting this in, but Elsevier is supposed to give me permission to use this. I got permission to use it for the textbook, but I'm awaiting actual permission to use it for the this presentation. But you can see the source of it. You can get full text copy of Dr. Genos's article on electromagnetic hypersensitivity. That was a real gold mine when Dr. Klein and I found that for our chapter. He found it, actually. I'm not taking credit for finding it. He found it. And we put it into that chapter on radiation exposure. So this is just another way of showing where on the spectrum these sources of radiation lie. So down on the left-hand side, you have hair dryers and toothbrushes. That's very low frequency, low doses of non-ionizing radiation. I don't want everybody to go home and be paranoid about using these small motors. But in someone where someone's been overexposed, or again, their detoxification mechanisms have been overwhelmed and they're exposed to a lot of radioactivity, then they can get hypersensitive to any exposure, including those smaller motors, or including the wireless technologies and computers. So some people become ultra-sensitive or hypersensitive to electromagnetic radiation, even the lower frequency, and we'll talk about those patients in a minute. So again, this is another visual of where these sources lie on the spectrum. Specific sources of ionizing radiation, we have radioactive elements and radionuclides. Like I said, I'm going to use those terms intermittently. Food irradiation, background radiation, medical radiation, nuclear weapons, and we do still develop nuclear weapons. So there are places in the country where they still develop nuclear weapons, and they have to dispose of that waste. And people in those communities are exposed from that radioactive waste. And that's a source of ionizing radiation again. And then nuclear power, which they keep calling clean because you can't see that it's emitting, carbon pollution, but nuclear power certainly doesn't release clean waste. It's full of radioactivity. So they do routine releases of radioactive steam and radioactive water. It just is below what they believe is a level that can harm anybody. But I have lined up health experts that would actually disagree and say, no, those routine emissions around nuclear power plants are actually dangerous, and we'll talk about that. Catastrophic events, clearly, Fukushima is still leaking radiation. I don't know how they can still say it's just like background radiation. It's been leaking since March 11th of 2011. But we'll talk about how they measure radioactivity from Fukushima in the provinces of the prefects around the power plant. We've measured it here in the United States because as it gets released into atmospheric winds, it is going to travel around the planet. And as it's up in the winds and traveling, it comes down in the rain. So we actually had evidence of Fukushima radiation within 6 days on the West Coast, and within 2 weeks they were measuring radioactivity from Fukushima in Massachusetts rainwater. So it certainly had reached us pretty quickly back in 2011. 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania was pretty much a near meltdown, and Chernobyl was a full meltdown. So we'll talk about how much radioactivity was released then. And here's where the nutrition connection comes in. We all love the periodic table, right? Some of our favorite wallpapers, the periodic table, right? Many elements from the periodic table are minerals and elements that are essential to human health, trace elements. And these are things that we require for health. And so for all these elements, there could be, and there are different isotopes, but there can be unstable isotopes. And that's what happens during nuclear fission. You create unstable or radioactive isotopes of those elements, and our body can't tell the difference. And so these unstable isotopes, they release energy. They're trying to become stable. So as they release energy, they're releasing ionizing radiation. And we're going to talk about a little bit about, here's the periodic table. We recognize some of our favorite minerals in there. And I'm going to talk about which ones become radioactive during nuclear fission, which happens in nuclear power plants and reactors, but of course happens in excess during a nuclear meltdown or catastrophe. The radioactive isotopes are produced from nuclear fission, and they can be taken up in the body as if they were their essential mineral counterparts. And this is right from the EPA. They say, well, the body doesn't know any difference it doesn't recognize the difference between radioactive iodine and regular iodine. And that's why and I'm going to talk about this, but they want to saturate our thyroids with potassium iodide in case of a nuclear accident, so that we don't take up the radioactive iodine. We saturate our thyroid with the regular iodine. But the trick with that is you're supposed to take it right away as soon as a nuclear accident happens. And a lot of counties are not stockpiling it like they should, and people aren't notified of the accident immediately, and so sometimes it's a little bit too late to take. But anyway, we're supposed to saturate our thyroids with potassium iodide in the event of a nuclear accident. So these radioactive isotopes are not just iodine. Okay, here for example, we have iodine-131 is radioactive iodine, and that mimics iodine. And strontium-90 is radioactive, and it mimics strontium and calcium. Cesium-137, radioactive, it mimics potassium. Plutonium-239, plutonium, one of the most carcinogenic substances on the planet, mimics iron. And so if you come in contact with plutonium-239, your body will absorb it as if it were iron, especially if you're iron deficient, right? Because we take up more iron when we're iron deficient. So you'll take up more plutonium if you're iron deficient. And just like same thing with the other nutrients. If you're deficient in them, your body's going to soak up more, even if it's a radioactive form. So once in the body, these radioactive forms travel through the bloodstream and they get incorporated into living tissue. Again, the body doesn't differentiate between the radioactive form and the regular form, the essential form. So as these radionuclides decay, the released energy is ionizing radiation. And it's strong enough to remove electrons from surrounding molecules or atoms. So if you have radioactive strontium-90 gets taken up as calcium, it's going to go right to the bone, and it's going to reside there. And as it decays, and it decays into other radioactive forms, it doesn't just disappear, but as it decays again, it's released in ionizing radiation. And I've had personal conversations with Dr. Sternglass, and I hope you get a chance to go and see his video. I'm going to show you the link to it. He's an amazing man. He's my hero. Anyway, he talks about how this strontium-90 settles in the bone and it radiates the bone marrow. And that's where your white blood cells and your red blood cells are made. So, of course, it's going to contribute to disease as it radiates your bone marrow. So anyway, the resulting free radicals of ionizing radiation, and again, it's oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen free radicals, they damage cell membranes and they can get through the cell and into the DNA, which we know is the blueprint of the cell. So when you change blueprints, if anybody's in construction, there's a husband wife is in construction there. You can't just change the blueprint. You can't change horses in the middle of the stream because the end result is not going to be the same. So when we change the DNA of a cell, it's either going to kill the cell or it's going to be a mutated cell. And we'll talk about what happens when we change the DNA and the cell survives. So low doses of, and this was a surprise to everybody. Dr. Petkow was looking at what can happen when ionizing radiation or a cell membrane is exposed to ionizing radiation. And what he found was low doses over a long period of time are even more damaging to the cell than a quick hit of radiation like an X-ray. Because low doses over time, it doesn't alarm the cell as much, and so the cell doesn't go into repair mode. And so low doses over time cause damage to that cell membrane, and again, you damage your cell membrane, you have an open door into the interior of the cell, and then radiation can get into the nucleus and damage the DNA. So this low dose, the idea that low dose radiation is very damaging to the cell is called the Petkow effect, and there's a link if you want to go to that later on. Now, just a little bit, little trick question here. Are these symbols the same? And they're not exactly the same, but they almost look interchangeable. But they are not the same. The one on the left is obviously the Environmental Protection Agency symbol, and the symbol on the right is the food irradiation symbol. As if it was good for you, it makes people think, oh, what a happy thought, The Environmental Protection Agency is approving irradiation, but that's not the case at all. They're different symbols. They just look similar. So food irradiation uses ionizing radiation, uses gamma rays from cobalt-60 and cesium-137, a lot of which is just leftover military nuclear waste, and they use it for food irradiation. And it also uses X-rays and electron beams. And again, cobalt-60 and cesium-137, they come from military and commercial nuclear facilities. So it's nuclear waste, and they use spent fuel rods as well. Because what they want to do is they want to expose the food to ionizing radiation to kill bacteria, basically. And that will extend the shelf life of food. So they irradiate meat so it can sit on the shelf longer, which I don't know if that's the greatest idea. But a lot of people are concerned because, yeah, you sterilize the meat, but it can still get contaminated later, with someone's hands or bacteria from someone's hands. So it's not a foolproof method, but it does kill bacteria immediately. Not all bacteria. And then the ones that survive could become radio resistant. Anyway, so irradiation facilities, it doesn't necessarily make the food radioactive. And Dr. Sternglass, we talked about this a little bit. But, those fuel rods that sit in water, they get raised up to expose the food. And if that radioactive water were to splash on the food, then that food could become radioactive. But that's not actually a huge concern. Part of the concern with radiation facilities or irradiation facilities is that they discharge nuclear waste into the sewer systems, and they're not supposed to discharge a lot. In some cases, they're not supposed to at all, but it has been done by mistake. And I've gone to places where people in the neighborhood didn't even know they were right next door to a food irradiation plant, and they weren't aware that they discharged radioactive waste into the environment. Now, this is Dr. Sam Epstein. He's an MD, and I think StopCancer.com, I should have put his link up there. He's vehemently opposed to food irradiation. And not only that it's dangerous to have the facility in your community, but that irradiation food actually does cause profound chemical changes in the meat. Because remember, ionizing radiation breaks chemical bonds. And so it can produce an excess of benzene, but also new radiolytic products that hadn't been seen before. And some of these may be carcinogenic. And there's quite a bit of backup for that irradiation can produce these radiolytic products. But again, they say, don't worry about it. It's just a little radiation. It's just like background radiation. Don't worry. But obviously, there's a dose relationship. The more you're exposed to, the less your body can tolerate. Also, now there is some evidence, according to Dr. Sam Epstein, and I've seen some of the studies that irradiated food can induce genetic damage, and some of the studies that they have done. And it also causes major losses of vitamins, especially A, C, E, and the B complex. So you can look at some of those articles on your own there. Follow those links. This is just a little something from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that says it's okay if you release the radioactive waste into sanitary sewage systems just as long as it's just a little bit and it's readily soluble, so that's in water, which to me makes it spread more. But they have some criteria that makes it okay to reduce that radioactive waste. And again, you can go to that website if you want to. Other sources of radiation, we have background radiation, and that comes from cosmic radiation, actually out the stars and the sun. And those heavily charged particles and gamma rays do radiate us, okay? And even UV light from the sun, right, can cause radiation damage. But we do have a protective layer against the UV light from the sun, and it's called the ozone layer. But when we rip a hole in the ozone layer, which we do on many occasions, that UV light that comes through can be damaging to our skin. It damages crops. It damages plankton in the ocean. And it makes me think of Soylent Green. If anybody's seen that movie, don't think about the end, but think of the movie where the plankton in the ocean was all gone, you know, and we do have some damage to plankton in the ocean now because of the damage to the ozone layer and the allowance of UV light through. So the sun and the stars, they radiate us, but we have some protection from that. But exposure to this cosmic radiation is increased at higher altitudes. So, you know, places like Denver, the Mile High City, you know, which is aptly named at this point, the Mile High City, but you're closer to that cosmic radiation. You do get a higher dose. And you get a higher dose when you fly in an airplane. You're up in the air 30,000 feet. So you do get zapped a little bit more by that cosmic radiation. Terrestrial radiation, this radioactivity does occur naturally in the Earth. Uranium, they mine for uranium, which may be a mistake. I had heard a lecture by a nurse who went to the front lines during the Iraqi war as a nurse, and she got exposed to depleted uranium because we were using depleted uranium weapons over there, and we'd shoot at them and explode their tanks. And then the nurses would go to the front lines and see if anybody was hurt, and she got exposed to this depleted uranium. And she got really sick. But anyway, she had a Native American heritage. And she talked about how, yes, the Native Americans understood what uranium was. They called it knedge. And they said, leave it in the earth. Leave it undisturbed. You should never take it out of the earth. But we do mine for uranium. So the terrestrial exposure to ionizing radiation is increased when you mine for uranium. Okay? It becomes airborne. It can get into the water, et cetera. And then we have internal radiation inside our bodies, and it starts from birth. And I really couldn't find the answer to this. Is it because of radiation that we ingest? I don't think we're born radioactive, but we ingest these radioactive particles, things like carbon-14 and radioactive potassium. We consume it from the environment, and it's in our bodies, and we actually are exposed to that radiation from the inside out. And so we're going to talk a little bit again about how to protect ourselves from that internal radiation. Medical radiation, diagnostic, and radiation from CAT scans and X-rays is a significant source of ionizing radiation. And it has cumulative effects. So the more X-rays you've had over a lifetime, the more damage to your cells, and it's something to think about, and especially CAT scans. They're one of the major sources of cumulative doses of ionizing radiation. So it's not just something that you can do over and over again. And sometimes, you know, we'll talk about this a little bit with pregnant women, they used to radiate them or take an X-ray right before birth to see the position of the baby. And Dr. Alice Stewart started to really study this because she said, you know, the children of these women who had X-rays just prior to birth, those children were getting leukemia and they were getting cancer. And now we know how dangerous X-rays are during pregnancy. And so there is not just for pregnant women and fetus, but for everybody, there is a limit to how many X-rays we should have because it accumulates. Dr. Goffman says that X-rays and CAT scans are a principal cause of cancer, mortality, and ischemic heart disease. So they damage us, okay? And side effects, even medical radiation therapy, when it's used as a therapy against cancer, the side effects include cardiac complications, thyroid cancer, renal and GI dysfunction, hypertension, and anemia. So even when medical radiation therapy is used for good, it causes damaging side effects. It's a lot of information, right? Take a deep breath. Nuclear bomb testing. We know that that's a source. You know, we did all this testing, gosh, back in the 40s. Of course, we dropped the bomb in the 40s, but they were doing this testing in the 40s too. And with animals, they realized that dogs were taking up, the dogs they tested would take up the strontium-90 and got into the bones. And one of the first signs of strontium-90 uptake was osteoporosis in dogs because you have radioactive strontium-90 in the bone and it decays. So it leaves holes, and it also radiates the bone tissue. But anyway, so I'm sorry. But testing of nuclear weapons is a major source of ionizing radiation. And this is in the atmosphere, atmospheric testing from 1945 to 1980. Unrestrained release into the environment of substantial quantities of radioactive materials. And that was in the atmosphere, and again, it travels in those atmospheric winds. So even we did bomb testing out in Nevada, that radioactive waste from that testing went up in the air and traveled all over the world. And we'll talk about how there were concerned, dentists started it, but they started to test baby teeth to see if that radiation was being absorbed by humans. And we'll talk about how can you track, radiation from bomb testing into the bone. We'll talk about how you can do that. So the National Resources Defense Council estimated that just that above ground bomb testing, because they still do some underwater water testing. We're not supposed to do any more testing, but there is some being done. But that testing specifically, the atmospheric testing, they believe that it released the equivalent of over 29,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs as far as the amount of ionizing radiation that was released. So that bomb testing was like dropping bombs. They're testing those bombs, but they're dropping those bombs. And 29,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, that's a lot of radiation. And so the bomb testing, we know, led to cancers, and we'll talk about that. So I had to put this in there. Blame the kitty litter. I heard this on NPR a couple of weeks ago. And this is interesting because they're still packaging up Cold War era nuclear waste. And they pack it up in Los Alamos, and they mix it with kitty litter, clay kitty litter, because the clay kitty litter can absorb the radiation and make it more stable. And so what they did all of a sudden, they switched over to organic kitty litter. Well, organic, in that sense, containing carbon, became a fuel for the radioactive waste. And they packed it up in drums, and when it got to the dump site, which I believe is in Yuma, when it got to the dump site, those drums burst open. And not like it was a nuclear bomb, but just like this slow burn, because the organic kitty litter provided fuel for that radioactive waste. So that was kind of scary, right? There's a fresh step. They're going to stop doing that, fortunately. But I was surprised to hear that we're still packing up Cold War era nuclear waste. I was surprised about that. Now, other sources of ionizing radiation, how are we exposed? Well, we've had 3 major catastrophes. And these aren't all that long ago, right? We had 1986 was Chernobyl, and that was probably the worst known to man, although I think Fukushima is catching up. But that was partially human error. And there was a big power surge, and they could no longer cool the radioactive fuel rods, and they melted, and that caused the meltdown of Chernobyl. And we know there were major health effects from that meltdown. 3 Mile Island, right here at home, mechanical failure and human error, and there definitely was an increase in cancer incidence. And many people believe that they never reported the full extent of that meltdown. But the radiation into the air and water the release was much greater than we were told. Fukushima, March 11, 2011. I really should put dash to present because it is still leaking. They haven't contained it. They should have listened to Michio Kaku, who said back in 2011, you have to contain this with cement. You have to make it sarcophagus and cover this up completely. And apparently haven't done that yet, and it is still leaking. But the earthquake and tsunami, this wasn't even human error, but this was a natural disaster that led to a man-made disaster. The earthquake and the tsunami caused a meltdown of 3 of the 4 reactors there that were damaged, and it continues to leak to this day. So it's still a concern. And then this is essential. The National Resources Council listed 5 nuclear power plants that had emergency shutdowns just in 2011. So we still have a potential for an accident. So I'm no fan of nuclear power because it's not clean. Just because you don't see the radiation being released doesn't mean that it's a clean source of energy. Okay, radiation dose and risk from Fukushima. I don't have to go into this too much in detail. You can do a little bit of your own research. But they do think it's not a big deal. Some people think that we're overblowing the fact that, like the migratory, the Pacific bluefin tuna, had radiation from Fukushima in it. And they said, don't worry about it. It's well below natural radiation sources like polonium-210, which is about the most carcinogenic, highest source of radiation on the planet. So they're saying, don't worry about it, it's below that. But that's a very serious source. And so how long is it going to stay below that if it continues to leak? So comparable to, and this is always the line, that any exposure to radiation is comparable to or less than the dose all humans routinely obtain from naturally occurring radionuclides in many food items, medical treatment, air travel, or other background sources. But I disagree, because when you ingest radioactive elements, it's a lot different. It's different than getting an X-ray. You're ingesting these elements and they bioaccumulate in the body. So it's not a one-time thing. They accumulate and they stay there in our tissues. To me, it's a huge difference. So I just put a little bit something about polonium because I didn't know much about it, and I looked it up, and it's pretty much one of the most hazardous radioactive materials known to man, and it is out there in its natural sources, but at low doses. So we don't want to get anywhere near the exposure we do to plutonium. Fukushima, this is just an article about how the radioactive iodine reached Massachusetts within 2 weeks. And my point in this slide, and again, you can go to the articles on your own if you want to, but the last paragraph on this slide, iodine-131, they talk about all the time, has a half-life of about 8 days, and so, after 8 days, half of it has decayed to something else, but half of it is still there. And they always say, well, it's a quick half-life, it's all going to disappear pretty soon. But that's iodine-131. Iodine-129, okay, which is produced by nuclear reactors also, nuclear fission, nuclear accidents. Iodine-129 has a half-life of 15.7 million years. And so that doesn't go away. And I don't know why they always ignore it. And they only talk about iodine-131. But 129 is present, and it's present for a long time. You can see it bothers me, right? Okay. So this is an article by Joe Mangano, and I've worked with him in the Radiation and Public Health Project. I went with him up to Washington to talk to Senator Reed, about the Radiation Health and Health Project, because it's one of the most important things, I think, in causes of childhood cancer. So Joe Mangano and Jeanette Sherman, she's an MD, have done extensive research, extensive publishing about this. And he found, and he's an MBA, so he's an expert. And he found that the radioactive fallout did reach the U.S. in 6 days. The radioactivity in rainwater, air, water, and milk that was measured, there were small samples, but it was measured, it was 100 times normal. And the assessments now are suggesting, as time goes on, that the exposure to radiation from Fukushima could equal or exceed Chernobyl. So it is a concern. And he found an increase in death rates when he looked at before and after the Fukushima event, and especially in infants. They are especially, we're going to talk about this, the developing fetus and infants themselves are especially sensitive to radiation exposure. And so that some people disagree with Joe Mangano's numbers, but I tend to put some faith in his research. Sources of ionizing radiation, again, the EPA actually is monitoring ionizing radiation exposure. They do downplay Fukushima a little bit, especially now because it happened so long ago. But they have a website called RadNet, and you can go there. It's a link at the top of the slide and the link at the bottom again. They do feel that now, since it's less radiation being released in Fukushima, that the levels found were very low and always well below any level of public health concern. But I'm concerned at a very low level. So I disagree with that statement. I think any radiation that can damage one chromosome and lead to one cancer cell, I think is not a safe level and should be of concern. This is the EPA's list of other resources that you can follow as far as exposure to ionizing radiation for Fukushima and future events. This is someone that did an evaluation of the research that has been done, and says that about 43 million Japanese were exposed to high levels of radioactive cesium and iodine, and they were just looking at cesium and iodine. But again, all those elements that we talked about, the radioactive elements we're going to talk about more in detail, they're all released, or many of them are released from nuclear fission in nuclear reactors and nuclear accidents. So they measure just a couple, but there are others out there that we may not be measuring at all. And the belief is that the total radiation exposure, again, is likely far higher than calculated or reported. So how does this ionizing radiation and not ionizing radiation, how does it affect our cells? How does it disrupt our cells and our energy systems? Well, we are bioelectromagnetic beings. And this is a quote from Dr. Klein, who is my co-author in that textbook chapter. Electromagnetic semiconductor matrix, that's what human beings are. And so, of course, we're going to be affected by external radiation, non-ionizing and ionizing. And again, it's the frequency of electromagnetic energy or radiation that is going to determine its effect on the body. And again, there are cumulative effects, but the frequency, the lower frequency, won't have such an acute damaging effect on the body. The physiological effects of electromagnetic radiation, we're going to talk about electromagnetic hypersensitivity, when someone's been pushed over the edge beyond the tilt point, TILT, that's toxin-induced loss of tolerance. Free radical damage, carcinogenicity, genetic changes, and then the critical periods of development. I wanted to mention those because that's obviously early on, first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Some women don't even know they're pregnant, but those are some of the most vulnerable periods for any exposure to any toxin. Okay, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, it's a real thing. The World Health Organization has defined it and has done a paper on it. It doesn't necessarily happen to everybody, but instead a subset of the population. They develop this hypersensitivity to electromagnetic energy, even the low frequency, okay? So they have an adverse reaction to lower frequency EMR. The pathogenesis isn't completely clear. This is actually rather new to us. May be triggered by exposure and bioaccumulation of toxins in radioactive compounds. But again, it's not just exposure and bioaccumulation, but it's how well does your body handle detoxification of some of these compounds. How protected are you from radioactive elements? We'll talk about that a little bit down the road. The World Health Organization has a working group that defined electromagnetic hypersensitivity, and you can read through that. Individuals experience adverse health effects when they're using or in the vicinity of any devices emanating electromagnetic or electromagnetic fields. And don't forget those smaller motors. If you're hypersensitive, you might not want to be using an electric toothbrush. Okay, you might not want to be using a blow dryer all the time. You don't want to leave your wireless on at night. You don't want to be in the same room as it, you know. And nobody really should stay in the same room as it. But anyway, here's the full report. You can read on your own if you're interested. Here are some of the symptoms of electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And these are symptoms of a lot of things, but you might be surprised to find that they could be from electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Headache, thought processing difficulty, memory impairment, heart palpitations, sleep disorder. Half of us are going, hey, I have those myself, you know. General malaise, blurred vision, weakness, dizziness, chest discomfort, muscle pain, tinnitus. I have wicked tinnitus, and I always wonder if it's worse because of there being so many wireless wavelengths, especially being in a hotel where they only have wireless. You're exposed to it all the time. Fatigue, nausea, night sweats, restless legs, and paresthesia, the tingling in the periphery. So these are the symptoms, and this is from 3 different sources, and there are plenty more, but I just listed 3 up there. What can happen? Why do some people become super sensitive to electromagnetic energies? Well, the bioaccumulation of toxins. Again, that could be chemicals, could be surgical implants, could be bacterial toxins. Don't forget, we have an infection, but those bacteria, not just that they're present, but they produce toxins, and those toxins can bioaccumulate. Dental material, radioactive compounds, all these things that we can be exposed to that can bioaccumulate. And that can lead to the tilt syndrome or tilt phenomenon. And that, what happens is after the threshold is reached, your body has taken all that it can, can't take any more. The immune system can't adapt normally to anything, and it overreacts to environmental stimuli, including EMR. But maybe it increases our sensitivities to foods and chemicals and all these other things if you've been overexposed in the past. All of a sudden you're hypersensitive to a long list of things. You might have reached the tilt point. And at this point, the immune response, antibodies, cytokine, interleukins, and chemokines, they may affect endocrine and autonomic nervous systems and genetic expression. So don't forget we have our genes, and then we have our phenotype. How do we express those genes? So that can change. And I'm waiting for permission to put this in here officially too. And again, this is from Dr. Genis's awesome article. I highly recommend you at least go and read the article online, if not print it out or keep a copy of it, about hyper EHS, I'm going to call it from now on. So the primary toxicant salts, you have chemical inhalants and implants and radioactive materials, and all these things we have not a lot of control over. And it causes that impaired tolerance. And then you're in tilt mode, right? And then these chemicals and pollens and foods and electrical fields just push you over the edge. And you have a completely dysfunctional immune response. And that's where the symptoms come from. So I had to put this in here. I was kind of shocked to find this. And I'll tell you, once you find one article, you want to look at the references for that article, and gee, what do they have to say? And this was a real surprise to me. I didn't know there was such a relationship between dirty electricity and diabetes and high blood sugar. So they find that transient electromagnetic fields, dirty electricity, those microsurges of electricity, right? And the kilohertz range of just what's on electrical wiring can contribute to elevated blood sugar among diabetics and pre-diabetics. As the blood sugar goes up for a pre-diabetic, eventually I say, hey, you're diabetic. They find the electronic equipment, wireless devices, but even walking on an electric treadmill increases blood sugar. And so this is, again, I have a PMID number there you can look up, or you can link to it directly and read a little bit more about that. And again, you go to those articles and see what their references are, and you can study a little bit further. Electromagnetic radiation. Let's go to IR, ionizing radiation. Again, repetition. Ionizing radiation removes electrons from most molecules, okay, including the water molecules. Anybody have water in the body? The body's 60, 70% water. So ionizing radiation can strip an electron from that water molecule and create a hydroxyl radical, a nasty hydroxyl radical. So what happens when we're exposed to ionizing radiation? We've been able to study it pretty closely, right, since the nuclear bombs in 1945, and the testing that happened before that and the testing that happened after that. We've had a good chance to study what are the effects on the body. And there are two major effects. The stochastic effects from ionizing radiation exposure, that's from long-term low-level exposure. And these are expected effects. You're going to see these eventually over time. And they come from damage to DNA, which will cause genetic or teratogenic mutations right during pregnancy, and damage at the cellular or molecular level that can cause cancer. We know as soon as we damage our DNA, if we damage that gene that controls cell growth, then we have cancer. We have out-of-control cell growth, and that's cancer. That's what cancer is. The non-stochastic effects, those short-term quick effects, high-level acute exposure to radiation from an accident or a bomb or X-rays and CAT scans over time, if you get exposed to those a lot. Those effects appear pretty quickly, and they're usually from a high dose all at one time. And they are more severe as exposure increases. And radiation sickness can lead to premature aging, nausea, weakness, hair loss, skin burns, diminished organ function. We see a lot of that, don't we? Diminished organ function. Think about what happens when the pancreas has diminished organ function, right? You can't digest food and you can't keep your blood sugar normal. Okay. The health effects specifically, and this is in the public domain, so I borrowed this from the EPA, and it's actually a website you can go to and calculate your own dose. How many REMs are you exposed to radiation? But you might not want to do that, because I think this presentation is upsetting enough. You don't want to go and find out exactly what your exposure is, right? Anyway, this is acute exposure just at 5 to 10 REMs, and I have all the calculations. If you want to go to the book, the chapter in the book from that Dr. Klein and I had written in Advancing Medicine with Food and Nutrients Edition 2, you can go into more detail about how to convert millisorbent to REMs and how much you might be exposed to. But if you know you're exposed to this level, REM level of ionizing radiation, you see changes in blood chemistry at 5 to 10 REMs. And then you can have nausea, fatigue, vomiting, hair loss, diarrhea, internal hemorrhaging, possibly death at 400. Destruction now, as the doses go up, and this is acute, exposure, most likely from a bomb or an accident, nuclear accident. Destruction of intestinal lining, internal bleeding, death eventually, damage to the central nervous system, loss of consciousness and death. And that can happen, within minutes if it's a high enough dose. This is, again, Dr. Abraham Petkow, I believe he was up in Canada, and doing studies on ionizing radiation in the cell membrane, and found that low doses of ionizing radiation over long periods of time were actually more damaging, more biological damage to the cell when you're exposed to low dose over a long time, which really shocked everybody. It's just a little bit. Don't worry about it. It's diluted out. They're diluted, right? If you believe that radiation is safe at any dose, but that's my opinion, that it's not safe at any dose. The cause of the long-term damage was from free radicals, he found out in his studies, and many foods and antioxidants can help protect us from oxygen-based free radical damage. We're not sure how to protect ourselves so much from carbon or nitrogen-based free radicals. Let's see, the biological effects of ionizing radiation persist long after exposure, and that was a little bit of a surprise too. But these nitrogen free radicals especially, they go into the cell and they disrupt the oxidative reduction balance in signaling in the cell. And so that alone contributes, right? Damage from free radicals contributes to carcinogenesis, fibrosis, inflammation, genomic instability, acceleration of tissue injury that's associated with aging, so it accelerates aging. And again, there's a link on the bottom there if you want to look at that study. This is the new one I found. You won't have this in your packages, I'm sorry, but I did send the new PowerPoint and the new handouts to Amy if you just want to print out this page with the new slide, just like the other one, the penetrative properties was a new slide. But I found this last night, it's like 11 o'clock. I'm like, oh my God, I got to put this in here. This is excellent. Ionizing radiation induces the hydroxyl radical. And the hydroxyl radical is like a crazy free radical. And it indiscriminately attacks nearby molecules. It doesn't care. Just boom, boom, boom. It's going to attack especially cell membranes, right? So what happens is it attacks water. And by stealing an electron from water, it creates hydroxyl radical. And so it might immediately create a hydroxyl radical or partial reactive oxygen species within the cell, which then becomes a free radical because the cell's mechanisms have become unbalanced. Okay? So either way, you're going to get this hydroxyl radical in the cell, okay, created from water, the ionized radiation exposure to water, and you have this hydroxyl radical. And fortunately, what they are finding, that some of the injury can be influenced by antioxidant status within the cell. And that's why you want to keep your cells bathed in nutrients. Okay, I'm a big fan, of course, of healthy food, especially if it's grown right out in the backyard and you can eat it fresh from the field. And if you're eating animals, you know the animals, you know what they were fed, say thank you to them. They're not overloaded with toxins. But to me, it's almost not enough. I still am a big fan of supplementation with high-quality nutrient supplements, especially in the natural form that they're found in food. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But anyway, if you keep your cells bathed in nutrients, you won't take up as many radioactive elements. And if you keep your cells bathed in antioxidants, you don't want to overdo it because you need some oxidation in the body. But keep an adequate level of antioxidant status in your body, like ascorbate, alpha-tocopherol, in your enzyme systems, like superoxide dismutase, the catalase, peroxidases. They can actually diminish intracellular reactive oxygen species. So if you're nutrient sufficient and antioxidant sufficient, and you get exposed to radiation, and that radiation starts stripping electrons from your water molecules and creates these hydroxyl radicals, you have enough antioxidants to quell those hydroxyl radicals. So you do want to make sure that your antioxidant status is adequate. I know that SpectraCell has a Spectrox as part of their test, and you can check out what your antioxidant status is. And they kind of fail you if you're below like 75. So they have pretty high standards to say that you're antioxidant sufficient. And I recommend the SpectraCell. As a matter of fact, they have Signet and Blue Cross Blue Shield now. It's taken or paying for SpectraCell. So your copay is very low now. It's like $190. So I'm going to go ahead and mine done again. So you want to keep your antioxidant status adequate in the cell so that you can fight some of the effects of ionizing radiation. So again, this is a slide you guys don't have, but you can see the PMID number. If you want to write that down, it's 790-5906. And you can, you guys can go to the newer PowerPoint handouts and copy that if you want to. Now, low-dose radiation. Dilution is not the solution to pollution. And I don't know if that's an original phrase coined by Dr. Sternglass, but I heard him say it myself. Dilution is not the solution to pollution. They used to think so. We still think so, right? We dump a lot of stuff in the ocean. It's a big ocean. We just dump in the ocean, right? And it'll dilute out and it won't hurt us. But as we know from the Petco effect, the low doses of radiation are just as damaging. Low-level radiation is insidious and damaging to our cells. So Dr. Sternglass has worked tirelessly since the 50s and 60s to educate people from his studies. This is what he did. He worked on lowering the dose of radiation from X-rays and things. That's what his job was with Westinghouse. And he realized, and he read these studies, and he read the baby teeth study back in the late 50s, early 60s, and said, you know what? All this nuclear bomb testing, we're actually being exposed, and we're absorbing this radiation. It's making us sick, and it's going to cause premature births and early infant deaths and childhood cancers, and we can't go on like this. And he wrote an article and was published in Science, and he was asked to testify before Congress. And Westinghouse came to me, told me, and said, Ernest, I'm going to send you on a month-long trip to Europe with your wife. It'll be a wonderful vacation. You don't want to testify before Congress. And of course, Westinghouse was a nuclear industry, part of the nuclear industry. And Ernest Sternglass said, I'm testifying, and I quit, basically. So he went on, and he testified before Congress, and he's just a great guy. If you could just look at his Berkeley interview, and it's about 55 minutes long, but you'll see how endearing and how intelligent and brilliant he is, and how he had this long 5 or 6 hour discussion with Albert Einstein, who just loved him. And it was just very interesting. And he talked about how early on in his career, he came to believe that low-dose radiation is very damaging to babies especially, but also to adults. And he worked tirelessly and has written articles and has published, and he started the Radiation and Public Health Project, and he started the baby tooth study, and that's when I met him in 1997, excuse me. He was testifying at a trial where people were trying to stop the Cassini launch because it had 72 pounds of plutonium on board. And I got to meet him, and he said, you've got to get involved in this baby tooth study that I started, and I did. And he has published a number of books and a number of articles about low-dose radiation and how damaging it is. And it's not just a theory, but he shows that infant deaths are on the rise on nuclear power plants, but they drop down significantly if a nuclear power plant is closed down. So exposure, direct exposure to ionizing radiation seems to be a direct cause of infant mortality. Okay, lowest doses of radiation can cause cancer. And this, again, Dr. John Goffman says, it's not a question anymore. Radiation produces cancer. The evidence is good all the way down to the lowest doses. And he worked tirelessly to educate people about that fact. And he's not just like this anti-nuclear kook. I mean, he started off studying this. He was an associate director of Lawrence Livermore Labs, the radiation labs out in Berkeley. He was a professor at Berkeley, so he's not kooky, but they try to make him out to be kooky because, it's a big industry. That's all I have to say. But he also talked about the association, as did Dr. Sternglass and Dr. Gould and Joe Mangano, the association of breast cancer mortality and radiation exposure, especially from nuclear power plants. And women within a certain, I think it was like 100 miles, if you're within 100 miles of a nuclear power plant or a source of radiation from nuclear power, you're more likely to die of breast cancer. And that was statistically significant. So here's one of Dr. Sternglass's articles. Here's an article about, at the bottom, from Joe Mangano about infant deaths and birth defects dropped significantly after nuclear power plant was closed. So it's not, to me, a political agenda. It's really a public health agenda to try to stop these releases into the environment. John Goffman, again, he had passed away in 2007. So he's no kooky guy. Had a PhD in nuclear and physical chemistry, had an MD degree. He was one of the first identified lipoprotein carriers of cholesterol. He studied heart disease, He was a pioneer in nuclear research. He worked on plutonium, uranium, and the Manhattan Project. He was an associate director at Lawrence Livermore. And they told him to research the health effects of ionizing radiation, thinking he would come up with the theory that it wasn't damaging. And when he studied it, he found out it is really damaging, and I have to talk about it, and they weren't happy about that. But he had to talk about it because of what he had discovered. He found that the ionizing radiation caused double-strand chromosome breaks. Well, one damaged chromosome can lead to cancer, right? Damaged DNA leads to cancer. And this is his biography. You want to link to that because you guys do also have the PowerPoint at your fingertips. The biological effects of ionizing radiation from the National Academy of Sciences, they publish these every so often, and the latest kind of said, you know, the smallest dose of low-level ionizing radiation has the potential to cause an increase in health risks to humans. So that's why I'm making such a big deal of it. And the tie-in to nutrition, again, isn't that it's radiation. You don't have to be in front of an X-ray machine. You're ingesting radioactive nutrients, and that's where the tie-in to nutrition is, and that's why it's our job, I think, to teach people how to protect themselves from that, to the point that we can. Okay. Genetic changes, you can have a disruption of growth, mitotic inhibition, chromosome aberrations, forward and reverse mutations, genetic damage. And again, a mutant gene can be passed on to children. And a mutant gene can cause cancer. So they found that just one radiation track can actually break a chromosome and damage the DNA, just one. So Dr. Goffman believes about 50% of all the cancers in the 20th century have been caused by low-level ionizing radiation, and about 3/4 of all the breast cancers. And I don't know if any of you before knew there was a connection between breast cancer and nuclear or ionizing radiation, but there is a very close connection, and there are a number of books that you can read up on if you want to. I'm talking about my story about FPNO. I want to talk about that. Okay, so anyway, the John Goffman, kind of a hero to a lot of people that want to get this information out. Cancer incidents in an area of radioactive fallout downwind from the Nevada test site. And of course, again, this is back in 1984, but all that nuclear bomb testing that was going on, you know, right up until like 1980, they would do it out in the desert, out in Nevada. And I was told too, and even Dr. Sternglass told me that they would actually call up like the Kodak plant, you know, Kodak photo plant, and who produced film, and they would tell them when they were going to do a test because they had to shut down things and really protect themselves because the radiation would overexpose the film that they were producing. So they called Kodak, hey, I'm doing a nuclear bomb test, but they didn't call anybody else and tell them. They didn't call the people who was in the area. But anyway, so that nuclear bomb testing out in Nevada, they did find, this is a good study that shows that they found a lot more leukemia, early leukemia and latent leukemia, more thyroid cancer, breast cancer, melanoma, bone cancer, brain tumors, GI cancers, were all increased well above what was expected. Okay, so that was a link to the nuclear bomb testing out in Nevada. Disruption of cells and energy systems. Again, babies, especially the developing fetus, that's on the exam, the quiz. Developing fetus is the most sensitive to ionizing radiation, and the effects are magnified in the developing fetus. And Dr. Alice Stewart demonstrated this because she correlated the x-rays that were taken during pregnancy actually led to leukemia in the offspring. And you know how paranoid, you can't even get a dental x-ray now if you're pregnant. You're not supposed to be anywhere near x-rays. But they used to x-ray the woman just prior to birth to check the position of the baby. And so that's just for birth, but the critical periods of development too are especially vulnerable to irreversible damage, and not just ionizing radiation, to any toxins. And a lot of women don't even know that they're pregnant at this point. But just look at when these organs develop. The central nervous system develops at 2 to 5 weeks of gestation. Okay, the developing fetus, the heart, 2 to 6 weeks of gestation, the ears, 3 to 10, the eyes, up to 7.5 weeks of gestation, legs and arms, 7 weeks, teeth, up to 8 weeks of gestation, the palate, 9 weeks, the external genitalia, up to 11.5 weeks of gestation. All these critical periods of development where damage is irreversible. If there's damage during a critical period of development for any of those organs, the damage is irreversible. So a lot of women don't even know they're pregnant. at that point. So definitely you want to teach them to avoid as many toxins as they can, and teach them maybe a bit about radiation exposure, including non-ionizing radiation exposure. Now, some we don't have control over. I mean, it's in the air, it's in the water, but we can try to protect ourselves from the effects at least. So again, radiation affects children most profoundly. This is an article by Michio Kaku, who's a super cool guy. He testified at that trial also back in, '97. Anyway, so I borrowed this table from him too, but you can see that age at irradiation or exposure to radiation, newborn baby and the developing fetus, but they have an 81% greater chance of cancer fatality, okay, per rem of whole body exposure if they're exposed at early ages, including 6.9 years of age, okay, 54% greater chance that they'll die of cancer, not just get it, but actually die of it. So and then it goes, the actual chance of mortality drops as you get older. So I guess that's a good thing, right, for us who are older, but not for us who have kids and might be worried about, exposure to children in an early age. All right, radioactive elements in the body. Here's the juicy stuff, right? So again, radioactive isotopes, radioactive elements, radionuclides, I'm using them interchangeably. They mimic their nutrient counterparts. And again, strontium-90, it gets taken up as if it were calcium. So it goes right to the bone. Of course, it also goes to the nerve synapses too, right, where calcium hangs out, don't forget. But in the bone, it's obvious, and it's actually easier to study. And they actually used to study baby bones, babies who had died back during bomb testing years. They would actually measure strontium in their bones. And then also in teeth, they found out were very reliable sources of measurement. So the strontium-90 radiates the bone marrow, affects your white and blood cell production and their function. And also osteoporosis, again, you're radiating your bone marrow, but you're also decaying your bone tissue because it has radioactive strontium in it. That's decaying. And strontium-90, it decays. It doesn't just disappear and not become radioactive. Strontium-90 specifically decays to yttrium-90, which goes to the soft tissues. And that goes to the pancreas and the pituitary gland and the ovaries and the testes and the mammary glands and the lung. So you have continued internal radiation once you've ingested some of these radioactive nutrients. This I had to borrow from Sarah Shannon. I just could not get a better screenshot. She's awesome. I used her book. She's updated her book in 2012. She updated her book. It used to be called Diet for an Atomic Age, and now it's called Radiation Protected Foods, a Menu for the Nuclear Age. And I borrowed this lady from her, and it shows you where these radioactive nutrients settle in the body and bioaccumulate in the body. So iodine settles in the thyroid, plutonium and uranium and radon settle in the lung, cesium, cobalt, and plutonium settle in the liver, sulfur settles on the skin, the radioactive form, right? Polonium goes to the spleen, cesium goes to the kidney, et cetera, et cetera. So again, all of these organs require nutrients, right, for their structure and their function. So we're going to absorb whatever's available. So if you saturate yourself, tissue saturation, with a good nutrient, you won't absorb as much of the radioactive nutrients. Bioaccumulation, as we know, toxins and contaminants concentrate as we go up the food chain, and they bioaccumulate, and we're pretty much at the top of the food chain. Oh, I haven't seen Godzilla. Maybe we're not at the top of the one. I didn't see that, but as far as we know, we're at the top of the food chain. And the synergistic effect of toxins in radiation, synergy adds up, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the synergistic effect is much greater when you combine toxins with radiation. It can increase the effect 1,000-fold. Here's just the half-life of radioisotopes. Nothing you have to measure or memorize, but you can see here what the half-life is, and some of them are in years, and some in millions of years, and a couple are in billions of years. So these things stick around for a long time and release ionizing radiation for a long time. And again, this is the tissue that's affected by those particular radioactive nutrients. The predicted genetic and somatic effects of carbon-14 that's caused by just 1 year of nuclear bomb testing. They figure, and this is an estimation, this is from Linus Pauling, okay, he published this back in 1958, about 55,000 children with gross physical and mental defects. You'll have about 170,000 stillbirths and childhood deaths, and about 425,000 embryonic and neonatal deaths. So he took the bomb testing threat very seriously, saying, you know, you can't just test these things as if it's benign. We're going to absorb the radiation just as the spell dropped a bomb on us. And you can see what his level of concern was. Now, how do we even really know that radiation in the body does so much damage, or even that it ends up in the body? Because back in the late 50s and early 60s, some dentists actually started saying, hey, let's collect baby teeth, and we will measure them for radiation, for strontium-90 specifically. And that gives you a snapshot of what the mother was exposed to during pregnancy. Because we know strontium goes where calcium goes, so it's going to go to the tooth bud. And when that first baby tooth falls out, it's a reflection of the tooth bud development, and that's a reflection of what the mom is exposed to during pregnancy. Because strontium-90 doesn't just exist in the environment. It's man-made, and it's man-made from nuclear fission. So when you found strontium-90 in the bone, you knew where it came from. And it was easy to track. So we were fortunate that it was just easy to take the baby teeth and measure those. So the presence of radioactive strontium in the deciduous teeth is a great marker of radiation exposure. So the St. Louis baby teeth survey was done again in the 50s and 60s, demonstrated the radioactive fallout was being absorbed by humans. And that study and Dr. Sternglass's work helped actually when they testified for Congress, and John F. Kennedy, who had just lost a baby, okay? His wife lost a baby right around this time. But they signed a partial test ban treaty to say, okay, no more nuclear bomb testing. And that was between Khrushchev and Kennedy in the middle of a Cold War where we thought we were going to bomb each other to oblivion. And they realized the damage that these tests were doing and the radiation they were releasing, and they shook hands and said no more above ground bomb testing, no more atmospheric bomb testing. So the St. Louis baby teeth again, the study collected about 385,000 teeth, and just after analyzing 60,000 of them, they found that the strontium-90 was 50 times greater in the baby teeth and born in 1964. It kept increasing than those born in 1951. Now, again, we dropped the bomb in 45, so we've had the strontium-90 in the atmosphere, in the environment. But as the bomb testing escalated, the strontium-90 in the teeth increased. So we had 50 times greater strontium-90 than those born in 1951. Now, from that first study, right, they collected 385,000 teeth, and they kept a little index card on every tooth and where was the person born and when were they born, their date of birth, their name, their information, and their baby tooth. And the current study, the Tooth Fairy Project, we repeated this study. We did it in 1997 to 2002. And Joe Mangano was called up and somebody said, hey, listen, there are we found in a storage bunker a ton of these baby teeth from the original 1950s study. Do you want them? We're going to throw them away otherwise. Because Joe Mangano was like, oh my God, yes. And they found 85,000 teeth, and they've gone through a lot of them. And that's another story, but they actually went and found some of these people and found out, well, who had strontium levels that were very high in their teeth back then and who ended up with cancer. And there was a direct correlation. Those with the high levels of strontium back then were more likely to get cancer now in their adulthood. Anyway, so that became part of the Tooth Fairy Project as well, studying those teeth from the 1950s. This is some of the published material from the St. Louis baby teeth. You can see it's published in 1963, 1961, 1958, and the International Milk Teeth Radiation Census, they called it, and it's eventually called the St. Louis Baby Teeth Survey. And it made a big impression, and there were moms pushing baby carriages, doing circles around the White House, demanding that something be done, according to Dr. Sternglass. And that's part of the reason that it got so much attention. And then they realized, Kennedy realized, hey, you know what? This is causing cancer. It's going to cause defects in the future generations. Let's stop above ground bomb testing. So the Radiation Public Health Project, Dr. Sternglass founded that. I met him in '97. They were just starting collections. And what we found was that levels of strontium-90 in baby teeth were as high today, back then, 1997 to 2002, in counties that were close to nuclear power plants, just as if they were still doing above-ground nuclear bomb testing. And strontium, after they stopped above-ground nuclear bomb testing, strontium in the general environment declined. And the government studied that and tested that. But when we did this study, it was by zip code, so you could tell if it was around the nuclear power plant, the strontium-90 stayed just as high in some kids, just as high as it was during the bomb test years. And I did some water sampling. We sent it in for analysis. And the strontium-90 in drinking water was significantly higher in the counties around the nuclear power plants. And what they found was and I wish I could find that slide, but the strontium-90 within like 20 miles of a nuclear power plant was very, very high. And then 40 miles away was only like half of what it was around the nuclear power plants. And then the strontium-90 after reverse osmosis, or the alpha particles that they were measuring, were nearly zero. So reverse osmosis is actually a good way to get the strontium-90 and the other radioactive elements out of the water. So we got reverse osmosis. And again, strontium-90, why does it go to the bone? Because it's mistaken for calcium and strontium. Strontium is an essential element as well. So it contributes to osteoporosis, childhood cancer, etc. These are just some more of the publications, a little bit more information about Dr. Sternglass and his study of low-level radiation. Too repetitive, 5 books published by the RPHB, summarized hundreds of articles in peer-reviewed journals that deal with the impacts of ingested low-level fission products. So you guys can do that homework on your own. Just remember, it is ionizing radiation. We do ingest it. It radiates our bone marrow and leads to childhood cancer. I think that's pretty simply put. Just a little bit more publications you guys will have in your handout. The cancer link, Joe Mangano. This is, you can actually directly read about this on the radiation.org website, which is the Radiation Public Health website. And again, this is about the leftover baby teeth. He got this phone call and he tells the whole story in detail. He's like, what? Who's calling me? And he was thrilled. A lot of work on his part, but he was thrilled to have it. And again, they found that there was a link when we went back and tracked down these adults, and found that when the strontium-90 was high in their teeth back then, they were more likely to get cancer. And I think prostate and breast cancer were the ones they were studying most closely. Cancer risk to medical for photonic fallout. Just these a couple more reports about the link between fallout and cancer. Let's see, we had here's a press conference about thyroid cancer cases around the Indian Point nuclear power plant. They are the highest in New York State, and of course, because you have that radioactive iodine, and the government takes that seriously enough, and I'll talk about how seriously, but to suggest that counties around nuclear power plants stockpile with potassium iodide, so that's available for people if there is an accident. Just another article. There's a lot of research in here. You guys can go through it on your own. Again, we just see that levels of strontium-90 around the babies around in the late 50s at the height of atmospheric testing. Those levels were just as high, and they correlated with cancer, childhood cancer. We did the latest study. Sorry about that. It's getting off track there. Again, here around the nuclear power plants, especially because those guys are up there, Joe Mangano was up in New York, they are apt to study the nuclear power plants right around them, and that was in Suffolk County, Long Island. We did it down in Miami at Turkey Point, and again, we saw that the cancer incidence for children 0 to 4 years of age was significantly correlated with the strontium-90 in their baby teeth. So we have data from that 5-year study, and found that, yes, the babies even nowadays around the nuclear power plants with higher levels of strontium-90 were more likely to get cancer, especially ages 0 to 4, when they're so vulnerable, The PubMed collection, if you get onto the actual PowerPoint presentation, you click on it, it should, I hope, bring you right to the actual PubMed collection. Sometimes it's a little glitchy, but I do have the actual link that you can copy and paste towards the end of this presentation. So again, these are just more RPHB articles that talk about low-level radiation and cancer, basically. Some say, no, you guys are all crazy, Dr. Goffman crazy, Dr. Sternglass crazy, Dr. Champlin, you're all crazy. You just fear-mongers, and you're just scaring people and making people think that radiation is a thing to be feared, and it's not. And this is an article presented to the health physicists who aren't really that health physicist oriented anymore. They're more really radiation physicists versus biological physicists. But anyhow, so this really scared me, and this is why I put this in here. In this article, it says that, hey, these fearmongers are making everybody scared of radiation. And if health physicists hope to be successful in changing public perception, the health physicists may have to focus efforts on the next generation and concentrate on assuring that elementary and secondary school children receive sound instruction on radiation risk. So these are people that think it's no big deal, it's just a little radiation. If you dilute it out, it isn't a big deal. And we're going to go right into elementary schools and secondary schools, and we're going to teach children that. So if they don't teach the opposing view and talk about all the research that's been done to show that low levels are dangerous, then that's kind of scary to me. That's a little bit 1984. But I had to put that quote in there. I'll probably go to jail for it. It's probably more than 50 words, but at least I told you where it came from. You can actually go and read the article itself. Okay, so protection. How do we protect ourselves? Okay. This, and again, I highly recommend you read this, at least read the study, get the full copy if you can. But he talks more about non-ionizing radiation. He talks a lot about wireless devices and things and how we can minimize our exposure. Cell phones and cordless phones, you want to minimize their use and the distance of the cell and cordless phone, and use speakerphones whenever possible. And not Bluetooth either, but like the real physical wire that goes in your ear and then down to the phone, or the speakerphone itself. And the cordless phones, like those 900 megahertz cordless phones, are some of the worst. They radiate a lot of radiation. Wireless internet, it is part of our lives now. I don't think there's any way to avoid it. They want to go wireless throughout some cities. You're always going to be exposed. I don't know if there's a way around it unless you're Amish, and that's probably gotten into the Amish county as well, country as well. You can't stop wireless if there's a tower near you, right? But if you can use wired internet, I wish I could at this hotel. They don't have a physical connection, but I bring my Ethernet wire with me so that I can go wireless. I mean, wired whenever I can. But the problem is, hey, in a hotel, you still got the wireless going through the airways, right? But anyway, wired is a better connection too. Turn off your internet router. After I read this, I now at night I shut down my router. I shut down everything. Click, I have it on a surge protector, boom, turn it off, turn it back on in the morning. It's no big deal. Especially if you have a lot of wireless devices in your room where you sleep, or your head might be, the head of the bed might be on the other side of the wall. There might be some kind of wireless device or smart meter or something you might not be aware of if you have trouble sleeping. Try to get yourself physically away from it. That's the point. Computers are releasing high EMR. I'm in front of it all day long, so I'm the first to go, right? Limit the amount of time spent in the distance. Try not to be right on top of it. Don't set a laptop right on your lap, even though it's a laptop. Not a good idea. Handheld electronics, try to limit their use. Turn them off before you go to sleep. How many people charge their phone while it's on, right at their head while they sleep? Easy things that just simple little steps you can take. You don't have to be paranoid or worried. Just these little steps are going to help, especially if you're near the tilt point. Fluorescent lighting, use alternative lighting, incandescent lights. Go back to those. They have some natural source lighting available. The funny thing is GE has it, and General Electric, of course, is they build nuclear power plants, but they are doing something good on the other end. They have natural spectrum lighting. Natural lighting, sunlight if you can. If you can open up your house or open up your windows, you don't really need lighting until nighttime, hopefully. Household power, measure levels and modify exposures if you can. Don't sleep right near the site of elevated EMR. There are some filters out there, and again, if you read that chapter in Advancing Medicine with Food and Nutrients, he talks about somebody can come into your house and do a measurement and see if you can reduce your exposure that way. High voltage power lines and substations. If you're near one, you are getting a higher dose of non-ionizing radiation, and you might want to reconsider buying a house near one. If you're looking and you don't live near one, but you're considering, you might want to reconsider that. Again, now in transmission towers, I went to a friend's house in Austin. Most beautiful house up on a hill right outside of Austin. I looked ahead. There were at least 8 towers directly in front of them. Michael Dell has a property where he has like at least 8 cell towers, and I don't know. I question the safety of that because she's only a couple of miles away from it. You're looking at 8 heavy-duty, high-frequency towers. Okay, now reduce exposure from IR or ionizing radiation. You want to distance yourself, if you can, from nuclear facilities. You want to minimize exposure to X-rays and CAT scans. You want to purify your water. Believe it or not, reverse osmosis is one of the best ways. Okay, it takes out, not only does it take out radioactive elements, it also takes out pharmaceuticals. I'm sure you've heard that there's a huge dose of pharmaceuticals in our drinking water because people flush it down the toilet or it's unmetabolized and it goes out in the urine and ends up back in our drinking water. So reverse osmosis takes out those pharmaceuticals as well. Actually removing the outer leaves and peels, you don't want to do that, but if it's in an area of radioactive contamination, you do want to remove outer leaves and peels. And they're resorting to that around the prefects and around Fukushima because they still have releases of radiation. Their food and their water is still being contaminated. And you want to saturate your tissues with essential nutrients to block the radionuclide uptake. So again, I'm all for, obviously via a health professional, but supplementation, nutrient supplementation. And I'll argue with any physician that says, you just have expensive urine. We have plenty of arguments against that argument. Okay, so here are some of the things we can do. Nutrient-rich diet and supplementation, that's what you guys talk about all day long. And now there's another reason to talk about it, right? To reduce your exposure to radiation. Selective uptake, again, if you have a lot of normal, good nutrients to absorb, you will absorb fewer of the radioactive nutrients. Protective foods, we talk about fiber, whole grains, that's tolerated. Miso, tofu, tempeh, non-GMO, vegetables, seeds, nuts, herbs, and spices. Those foods are very protective against radiation. You know what, too? I don't know why I didn't do this, but seaweed. Seaweed, I guess, is a sea vegetable. But the Japanese eat a lot of seaweed, and they're more protected because of that, okay? Supplements, we'll talk about vitamins and minerals, phytonutrients, and alkalizing diet. I wanted to put this in here. Thank you, IFM. They said I could use the slides. I always thank them. But just something to know about. Obviously, we know now that ionizing radiation causes DNA damage. Well, a simple deficiency of nutrients can cause the same type of damage to DNA. So that's a fact separate apart from the ionizing radiation argument that it causes DNA damage. But even without the presence of ionizing radiation, not having enough vitamins and minerals on board, especially, what do we have, folic acid, B6, niacin, C, E, iron, zinc, deficiencies of those nutrients can mimic radiation damage. Isn't that amazing? So again, this is another one. Somebody says, I don't feel like taking supplements. This is another thing we say to them. Micronutrient deficiency leads to DNA damage, genetic damage, and cancer. So there. And this is just some of the articles that support Dr. Ames' take on that. Okay. This is a little bit more information. This, I'm going to have to go into detail with you guys. I don't think you talk about this every day, and you're all well-versed in it. But again, it's another reason, maybe to stress to people that it's important to have a nutrient-rich diet. When you're well-nourished, you don't absorb as many of the radioactive elements. Okay, stable elements and nutrients block the uptake of radioisotopes. And here we have calcium will block strontium-90. Iodine will block iodine-131 and 129. Iron blocks plutonium. Potassium blocks cesium. Sulfur blocks radioactive sulfur. B12 blocks cobalt-60. And zinc will block radioactive zinc. So again, super important that people are nutrient sufficient. Might be a good argument for the SpectraCell test as a guideline. And repeat every 6 to 12 months. Protective foods, we listed those before. And fiber, insoluble fiber and soluble fiber are both important. We know it adds bulk, speeds the GI transit time up. It sponges up toxins, promotes growth of good bacteria, etc., etc. But it also sponges up toxins, again, and reduces their absorption. Whole grains, we know, provide more vitamins, minerals, fibers, and phytates than refined grains would. And phytates, we think, oh, they're not good, they bind minerals, and we can't absorb minerals, but the phytates will actually bind radioactive elements and help remove them from the body. So another reason to push whole grains, as tolerated, of course. And they do bind nutritive minerals as well. But if we're supplemented properly, we should be able to make up for that loss. Again, there are other nutrients that whole grains have more of than the refined grains. Miso, and again, I think any soy product should be GMO-free. The miso is a lactobacillus fermented paste. Age about 18 months, seems to be very protective against radiation. It has an alkalizing effect. It contains something called dispicolin, and that can help detoxify and eliminate radioisotopes as well. A teaspoon a day. You can add it to soups and sauces and salad dressing. It is very easy to incorporate miso into the diet. I have a bag of it at home. I'm not here. Tempeh, fermented soy, and they do recommend if you're going to have soy at all, have fermented soy. So here's a fermented soy product. Helps block cobalt 58 and 60. Beans and legumes contain minerals and phytates and protective proteases, inhibitors. The Bowman Burke from soybeans helps to protect against uptake. Vegetables, of course, you have your minerals, your fiber, chlorophyll. Don't forget that chlorophyll contains magnesium. The chlorophyll molecule, right? It's like the blood of the plant. Instead of it containing iron, like our blood contains iron, the chlorophyll contains magnesium. So anything green, people are going to get magnesium from, which is awesome. Phytonutrients, antioxidants, vitamin C, carotenoids, vitamin E, super right in there too. We're going to get some leafy green vegetables. Cruciferous vegetables, they contain sulfur. And if you are concerned at all about goitrogens, when you cook goitrogenic foods, it deactivates the goitrogen. So some of these foods, they might not be as healthy as eating them raw, however, it does deactivate the goitrogens. But they also contain sulfur, and that directly protects the mitochondria from radiation, which is awesome. And it also helps provide the sulfur-containing amino acids, provide cysteine, methionine, and they help to produce some of our detoxifiers. Sea vegetables like agar, dulse, hibiki, Irish moss, kelp, wakame, nori, seaweeds that we eat, in a Japanese restaurant. Rich in minerals, and they specifically reduce intestinal absorption of strontium-90. Kelp contains sodium alginate naturally, and that can actually separate ingested strontium-90 from calcium. So you'd absorb the calcium and dispense of, get rid of the strontium-90. So kelp, that's a good supplement to take. Seeds and nuts, of course, because they're good sources of vitamins and minerals, or herbs and spices, also very good sources of antioxidants and unique phytonutrients. I never leave them out. Sometimes we forget to encourage people to eat lots of herbs and spices, but they're easy to grow. Herbs are very easy to grow, and you can use fresh herbs at home. Supplements, again, a lot of these we use. Spirulina and chlorella were used after Chernobyl and bound up radioactivity and got rid of it out of the body. It was used heavily as a supplement following the Chernobyl catastrophe. Vitamins and minerals, again, we know by heart, right, the importance of vitamins and minerals for our metabolic processes and how over-processing food can deplete that food of vitamins and minerals. Phytonutrients, we know they're very unique to plants, why they call phytonutrients. And the phytonutrient content of food, you might not have known this, but it depends on whether it was vine ripened or not, cooked or raw, and what else is present at the meal as far as its absorption. Some are better absorbed with fat. We know that. But once you pick, a plant, a crop, it stops producing any phytonutrients. That's it. So when they pick them early, that food isn't allowed, or that crop isn't allowed to develop its full complement of phytonutrients that it might have. An alkalizing diet, we know that cancer cells thrive in an acidic environment, and the SAD diet is very acid forming, and so it's important to increase alkalizing foods, and we'll talk about what those are in 1 second. Dr. Jaffe, suggests that our first morning urine pH is 6.5 to 7.5. About 60 to 80% of our food choices should be alkalizing, and the remaining can be acid forming. This is just another slide. Thank you, IFM. And this is the first generation. I know they've had some since, but it shows you that detoxification of toxins is very much dependent on nutrients. Okay, phase 1 extremely dependent on vitamins, and phase 2 extremely dependent on amino acids. And the activated intermediate in the middle causes a lot of free radicals. These activated intermediates cause free radical damage, so you want to have a lot of antioxidants during this phase of detoxification to protect the healthy cells. So remember, if you have poor detoxification status, you're not going to be able to tolerate toxins. They're going to build up, and then you can become hypersensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. Phytonutrient super sources, again, you guys know this by heart. I think I'm going to go back, and I'm always revising this, but when I do present it to the IAACN, I want to mention the AICR.org, American Institute for Cancer Research.org. They have an awesome handout called Cancer Fighters in Your Food. And you can get for free, you can get the whole PDF, and it's going to list these sources and what nutrients and phytochemicals are found, the phytonutrients are found in these foods. Alkalizing foods. This is from Dr. Jaffe. Thank you so much. The most alkalizing foods and items, baking soda, you don't want to take too much of that, but sea salt, mineral water, umbashi plums, pumpkin seeds, lentils, broccoli flour. You can encourage your clients to not necessarily eat just these foods, but incorporate some of these foods every single day. And this one surprised a lot of people. Lime, you know, even though to your tongue it's acidic, in the body it's alkalizing, okay? And watermelon has a special place too, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Not only is it alkalizing, but it happens to fight radiation. So anyway, you can go through this. These are all alkalizing foods. This is the most alkalizing column, and this is the least alkalizing, but it's still alkalizing. And these are the most acid-forming foods. And this column is the most acid-forming, and this is the least acid-forming, but they all are acid-forming biochemically, right down at the cellular level. Protection from IR. I found this one. I think it ended up in the slides that you have, though. Watermelon juice, 50-50, 50% water, 50% watermelon juice, was radioprotective. It significantly increased the superoxide dismutase activity and glutathione levels. And it decreased the byproducts of radiation damage. And people, I know there are a lot of people out there, I can't touch carbohydrates, I can't have any fruit whatsoever, watermelon is poison, you know, and just, wow, you know how many theories are going around out there. And some people do much better on a low-carb diet, given. But you can have some carbohydrates, and I would choose watermelon, you know, and we can go into that whole theory down the road, but watermelon juice specifically was found to help protect against radiation, and acetylcysteine protects against radiation, spirulina protects against radiation, and those are very easy to incorporate into our supplement plan and food plan. Potassium iodide, I'm sure you guys have heard of that, right? And here's the deal. After 18 years after 3 Mile Island, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission came up with a plan. And their plan was that states with a population within 10 miles of an emergency planning zone, basically 10 miles around a nuclear power plant or storage facility, that they consider, they're not required, but that they consider including potassium iodide as a protective measure. And they never came along and said you have to stockpile potassium iodide for your population. They never said tell your population around the nuclear power plant that they should stock potassium iodide themselves. Nobody is telling anybody. It's kind of crazy. But you can go to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission website, you can go to the FDA website, you can go to the CDC website, and talk about how, hopefully it's within an hour of the accident, right? But who's going to find out about it within an hour, number one? Number two, who's going to get that stockpile of potassium iodide and deliver it to the people? I'll tell you right now, the National Guard is probably going to take that potassium iodide and get it to their family and get out of town. So I don't know what the answer is. Should we stockpile it ourselves? That's up to you. But potassium iodide completely, and these are high doses. These aren't doses you take every day. But potassium iodide completely saturates the thyroid so that there's a much less chance of someone taking up the radioactive iodine. Okay? So stay saturated all the time, I say. Not oversaturated, but sufficient at least. Now some think, an Italian researcher, now the NRC is saying, oh, within 10 miles of a commercial nuclear power plant, because everybody knows that radiation just stops, right? A little glass ceiling around a power plant just stops within 10 miles. But an Italian researcher said, no, you know, you really should be stocking potassium iodide for children within 200 miles of any potential source of radioactive iodine pollution. And we're probably all within 200 miles of something. But anyway, so those Italians, right? Mr. Gianelli, he's just, you know, he's out of control. That's an excessive measure, but I don't think so. I think it's a pretty safe thing to do, as well as stockpiling supplements and just load up on it if there is an accident. Why not, right? only, under the care of a qualified healthcare physician, of course, or say healthcare practitioner, I should say. Sometimes we're more qualified as far as supplementation. Now, CDC states the thyroid gland can't tell the difference between stable and radioactive iodine. It can't tell the difference. It's going to take up the radioactive iodine if you are not iodine sufficient. So again, you should get iodine sufficient. Now, here's a table from the FDA, and it talks about how to dose it. And it really, these are pharmaceutical doses. You don't want to just take these every day. But, adult dose is like 130 milligrams. That is a lot, right? When the RDA is 150 micrograms, we're talking about 130 milligrams. So you're really kind of overdosing in the event of a nuclear accident. And that protective effect, it lasts for about 24 hours. So it depends how much is being released, how much are you exposed to, how close are you to the source, et cetera, et cetera. So optimally, it's dosed daily until a significant exposure has passed. Okay. Now, Lisa had asked me to talk a little bit about homeopathy. I found some support for it, and I have mixed feelings. And we are energetic beings, and homeopathy works for a lot of people, and I love that. It's not my area of expertise. I don't push it. I do suggest people try it. It seems pretty benign, and it is based on electromagnetic, our energy in our body. So I don't disagree with that. I just don't. It's not my area of expertise. So I found a couple of articles, and along with those articles, I found a lot of critique about those articles. So it's up for you guys to decide. But Lisa is a pharmacist with IAACN, and she is really into homeopathy, and Jim Lavelle is a pharmacist, and he's really into homeopathy. So if you were going to go that route, here are some suggestions, but I would consult with a qualified practitioner about this. Okay, here's a couple of things. They did find that it reduced itching, radiation-induced itching for breast cancer patients, and these are pretty good, well-controlled studies. Okay, we're already at our questions, so you guys have to think about this a little bit. How do you want to do this, Amy? You want to talk about it all amongst ourselves? You want to take a little quiz, or what?
How do you want? Are you talking about for credits or just to review?
Yeah, for the credits. Well, why don't I answer any questions you guys might have first?
Why don't you can forward the questions to us that you want us to answer? How's that? And then we'll just get them.
Yeah, they're in the slide. They're on the slide. Do you see them?
Yeah, I see them.
On the handout?
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, so we'll do that, and if that's how you want us to do it.
Yeah. Well, I don't want us to just, but why don't I do this? Let me go over it with you guys. At least you'll know, what the answers are. So radiation causes cellular damage and dysfunction, yes or no?
True. Yes.
True. I think that's pretty convincing evidence that we looked at today. The electromagnetic spectrum encompasses which of the following? Ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, radio waves, microwaves, which ones?
All of the above.
All of those things fall in the electromagnetic spectrum, that's right. Ionizing radiation is unable to remove electrons from surrounding molecules?
False.
False, because it does, and it strips those electrons and creates free radicals, right? Creates a hydroxyl radical from water. It's insidious. Radioactive elements can be taken up and incorporated into tissues as if they were nutrients?
True.
True. Absolutely true, and that's where nutrition comes into play, right? Now, which radioactive elements mimic calcium, potassium, and iron, respectively? Let's see. What mimics calcium? Well, strontium does, right?
790.
Strontium mimics calcium. Cesium mimics potassium. And plutonium mimics iron. So that third one is the answer. Strontium 90, cesium, and then plutonium. All right, next set of questions. Ingestion of radioactive elements is the same as being exposed to X-rays or sunlight. What do you think?
We're saying false because it's worse.
It's worse. You're radiating yourself from inside, and it bioaccumulates. So it's absolutely not the same. And an X-ray is like blink, and it's gone, right? But if you take in strontium 90 into your bone, it's going to sit there, Okay, sit there for a long time and convert to yttrium. So it's not the same. And that's my argument where they always say, it's just like sitting out in the sun. You know, it's just like being exposed to cosmic radiation. But it's not, you know, because you're radiated constantly from the inside. So according to the Petkow effect, which radiation exposure causes more biological damage? A short burst of high-dose radiation? Long-term exposure to low-dose ionizing radiation?
Yes.
Microwaving your food? Or 30 minutes of sunlight daily? Or none of the above, because radiation doesn't cause biological damage?
Long-term exposure.
Long-term exposure to low dose, and that's the Petkow effect. Which radioactive elements bioaccumulate in the liver?
Plutonium.
Plutonium, yep. And cesium and cobalt.
Okay.
All three of them. But the iodine, that goes to the thyroid. Which of the following is most susceptible to damage by radiation? If you guys have any, too, give me any critique. If you think like a question doesn't make sense, something I should change throughout the program, please tell me.
No, they're all good.
They're good so far? Okay. Which of the following is the most susceptible to damage by radiation? Your pets, the zygote, the elderly, the developing fetus, or none of the above?
Developing fetus.
Absolutely, the developing fetus. Which of the following protects us from the negative health effects of radiation? A diet rich in antioxidants, a diet rich in fiber, an alkalizing diet, or a diet rich in vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients?
All the above.
All the above. Very protective. Now, did you guys realize that nutrients could be so protective against radiation?
No.
Is this a surprise to anybody?
In some ways, yes, in some ways, no.
I was surprised. You know, once I got into it and started to study it more and more, I realized that, you know what, nutrition really does play a big role. And I think we're kind of obliged to maybe mention that, because a lot of people are concerned about Fukushima right now. I'm concerned because they want to build more and more nuclear power plants, because they keep saying it's clean energy, just because it doesn't emit carbon. I'd rather it emit carbon than radiation, you know? So, Dr. Sternglass really feels that ideally you could very easily take all these nuclear power